The following is a midterm study guide produced by Dan Stevens, instructor of public administration at the University of Central Florida's Osceola Connect Center. This pertains to PAD 4720 survey research methods. Okay, just so we're clear, this is the iteration of the study guide you should be following. You can find this in the files section of the web portal, and under files it should be under study guides, midterm exam, obviously. Note that I will actually be eliminating some of the topics, and I will mention that as we go along. First entry on the study guide is the basis of knowledge is agreement. Consider the fact that the world is round, not flat. Not everybody was able to go out there and verify that firsthand, so you had to actually start trusting people. You can't verify everything firsthand. So that's where the agreement part comes in. Chapter 1 of your textbooks, under the subsection Looking for Reality, starts out distinguishing between epistemology, which is the science of knowing, and methodology, which Babbie, the textbook author, likens to the science of finding out. And you'll see as we go through this semester, much of this course is centered on this concept, trying to find, trying to discover, trying to better understand all the various questions: if, what, why, how much, whatever. The next entry, understand causal versus probabilistic reasoning, will actually be deleted. Chapter 1 mentions 4 errors of inquiry: inaccurate observation, overgeneralization, selective observation, and illogical reasoning. Now I've added a few ways to help you guard against these. Inaccurate observation is one of the 4 errors we're going to discuss. Think about this. There are a lot of students that attended my first class meeting, and usually several weeks into our course, I ask, do you remember what I was wearing? Now some students might remember, but for the most part, I've already worn 3 or 4 different outfits since then, and all of a sudden your memory becomes any kind of blurs. So that's why researchers shouldn't rely overly much on recollection. I know this firsthand because when I go back through my photos of my kids are one of the most important things to me. However, I look at baby pictures, I'm going, okay, which one is that? Is that Tiffany? Is that Alex? Is that Brandy? Oh man, it makes you feel bad. Anyway, so inaccurate observation. Remember that one. Next, we have overgeneralization, specifically limited sample size. Now, I'm sure every different issue in the world has some example, some instance where you can say, okay, I know someone that this happened to, whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean you can generalize that to the rest of the population. You need to have a representative sample, the size of that sample, so that you can accurately predict what's going to happen to the rest of the population. And then we had the non-representative sample, like the slide shows. Every mechanic I know has borrowed a tool and neglected to return it, but that doesn't mean you can assert that no mechanics are trustworthy. Think about stereotypes. And then we have selective observation. That's where you only see what you really want to see. The example I use in the slide is the Bermuda Triangle. You pay attention to all the things that support your contention, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should ignore all the other facts. Okay, pretty much anybody who's played the Florida Lotto has fallen victim to the gambler's fallacy. You might have some favorite numbers. Oh, okay, these are the numbers that I'm going to use. They're going to come up more often than the other numbers, the rest of the numbers. That's not the case. We all know all the numbers have an equal chance of being selected. Even if, the last 6 lottos have hit the 3, number 3, each time, you can't say, well, chances are this time it's not going to happen. That's the gambler's fallacy. As Babbie, your textbook author, describes reference group theory, he says this theory says that people judge their lot in life less by objective conditions than by comparing themselves with others around them, which is their reference group. So he actually uses the example, if you're making $100,000 a year, well, you might be living like a king if the median income wherever you live is only $50,000 a year. You're making twice as much. However, if you're living in a well-to-do area and you're making that same $100,000, but everybody else is making $500,000 a year, well, you might feel like the low man on the totem pole. So that's reference group theory. It's all contingent on your environment around you. Number 6, the objects of social science research are typically aggregates, not individuals. You have to start out by understanding what an aggregate is. Obviously, you know what an individual is, but you don't want to necessarily just find out about a particular individual. It just doesn't do much good for the rest of the scientific community. You want to find out about aggregates, about masses of people, about select groups that pertain specifically to your research. So that way you can generalize your findings to other groups elsewhere, other similarly situated folks. Like, for example, my research forte is active or human-powered transportation, walking and bicycling. So I study things here, and then that way, when another similarly sized city or community elsewhere in the world wants to find out the answer to their problem, say like, hey, this guy in Orlando, this is what he discovered. So that way you can find out what happens in the aggregate on a large scale. A variable is made up of a set of attributes, while attributes are actually characteristics of people and things. For example, in this slide, you have the variable gender, and then you have the attributes male and female. So gender asks, what is your gender? And then male and female are more or less the descriptors, the answers. So the second, another such example, social class. What social class are you in? What is the variable social class? Well, the attributes could be, you're wealthy, you're poor, you're middle class, whatever. I think the easiest way to explain independent and dependent variables is to use a bar graph that relies on the theory of supply and demand. In this case, we're using bushels of apples. If you have your price, which is your independent variable, high, that means you're not going to sell a lot of apples. But if you lower your price, you move that to the left, you're going to sell a lot more apples. So in other words, the amount sold is the dependent variable, and that depends on the price, which is the independent variable. Number 9 discusses the difference between ideographic rationale and nomothetic rationale for explaining the world. The ideographic, as Babbie describes, basically covers all gamut of explanations. It goes into great detail, all these different reasons and whatever, whereas nomothetic just is a real general way of looking at something. So if you read the passage in the Babbie text, it's actually fairly clear. Just so you know, word to the wise, this is not one of those distinctions that I've really ever run across in the real world. So don't beat yourself up with this one. Inductive and deductive theory are often confusing to students, so I typically liken them to a traffic scenario in my face-to-face lectures, as paranormal, right? Anyway, so the next slide shows that traffic is behaving as normal. Pedestrians are crossing at the crosswalks, cars are yielding to the pedestrians and the cyclists, and everybody's obeying the traffic signals, things like that. So everything's good. However, I've often observed that pedestrians will go out of their way, walk away from a crosswalk to mid-block and cross the street. Now, this is where I'm observing a pattern. If I observe a pattern first and then I go and consult the literature and see what the theories say, that's inductive theory. That's right. Observe the pattern first, then consult the literature. Deductive theory is where I hear about something, I read about something in theory, and then I'll actually go out and test it in the field. So again, inductive theory and deductive theory, one, it just really depends on where you're actually observing the patterns and testing it. By the way, the answer to the riddle, why do pedestrians cross mid-block? From what we understand, they only have two directions to look, left and right, if they're mid-block. Whereas if they're at a crosswalk at a four-way intersection, they have to look left, right, frontwards, and backwards. So it actually doubles the likelihood that they could get in a collision. Determinism and agency. These are two terms that social science researchers grapple with when trying to explain human behavior, human phenomena. For example, Babbie, our textbook author, uses uses prejudice to explain this concept. Prejudice may be a person, their upbringing, their parents had a certain degree of prejudice, maybe their religion, maybe their socioeconomic standing, are they rich or poor, their jobs, all of these factors can all contribute to a degree of one's prejudice. However, you also have to take into consideration free will, which is agency. Yes, despite all these other factors, you're still an individual and you can make your own choices. Now, I prefer to use my own personal experiences, particularly my wife's. My wife was raised in a household that actually, well, her parents got divorced a number of times. And that was very impacting. That's why I say that. Um, Instead of following in her parents' footsteps and eventually getting a divorce, the slightest opposition, the spousal fights or whatever, over whatever topic, she hung in there because she thought, I'm going to do something different. I'm not going to yield to my upbringing. I'm going to be a free will, in this case, agency, and I'm going to do it my way. So there's the definitions of determinism and agency. Quantitative pertains to numbers. And the slide you can see he is 6 feet 7 inches tall. They eat 6 meals a day. President's approval rating is at 73%. Yeah, this is a dated slide. However, a qualitative, he is tall. They eat all the time. President is really well liked. Terms saying uses terms in the general sense. And I often explain these terms to students. Quantitative is going to give you a broad understanding of a topic, lateral, whereas qualitative is going to give you depth of understanding. I particularly like Babbie's uh, example in the textbook when he talks about his acquaintance from China. And the reason being, the person is of a certain age, but it says he's older, than his years. He's more mature. And so while quantitative might look at the number, he is this many years old, qualitative would look at it in terms of, yes, he is this old, but he is this mature, and therefore it might give you a better understanding as to the qualities of the person. So, take it for what that's worth, quantitative versus qualitative. I guess, the course you go depends on the research topic. Three elements of the model of science are theory, operationalization, and observation or hypothesis testing. I'm going to start out using the same example that Babbie uses in the textbook, comparing social class and delinquency. Now look at the first slide. You'll see a graph there. If you've got high social class, whatever that measure is, however they measure social class, if it's 9, if you're in the upper echelons of social class, if at 9, you can see, according to this theory, you would be a 2 on the delinquency scale. So high social class would equate to low delinquency. Conversely, if you're only at a 3 in social class, that bumps it up to an 8 on the delinquency axis. So that's one way to look at it. That would be the theory. Now this isn't a legitimate theory. This is something I made up in MS Excel, but that would be a theory that you'd start your basis of your experiment on. Next, you go to operationalization. Now I'm going to use the same exact example. In this case, it would be what constitutes, being rich. Let's say if you make $100,000, well, that's pretty good. In some circles, maybe the guy who lives in an economy where the median average, the median income is 50,000 bucks. Yeah, you're banking $100,000. You're double what the median average is. However, what if you live in Islesworth or someplace where $100,000 and you're comparatively you're on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. So operationalization would get that straight. When I say rich or when I say wealthy, this is what I mean. Okay, and then of course finally the last slide, observation or hypothesis testing. As you're going through your experiment, you want to actually go out and do your observations. You want to test whether these conditions actually match your hypothesis or vice versa. You want to see, you made a hypothesis, you've said, this is what I predict is going to happen. Does it or doesn't it? And so those are the three main tenets of the model science. Two of the primary ethical concerns of social science research are that participation is voluntary and that no harm will come to participants. First of all, participants should know that their service is voluntary, that they can elect to opt out at any time without penalty. No one should be forced to participate. Secondly, no harm should ever come to participants. Not only should the people know that they're actually engaged in a research project, but they should be assured that they will never be harmed as part of the project. Don't worry about the question that addresses arguments against voluntary participation. I'm going to omit that from the midterm. Okay, being that we've been discussing ethical concerns in social science research, the formalized manner by which we advise participants about our research is called the informed consent. This document is a physical document. They will sign it. It will detail all of the potential risks that they could, they could experience during your research, and so that way they can actually make a conscious decision whether or not to even participate. Okay, potential sources of harm is a wide open field. You have to consider it's probably something that's not going to wind up on your test. Don't tell anybody I said that. Okay, here's the thing though. You do need to understand this because whenever you're creating your informed consent document, you're going to need to be able to address sources of harm. What I'm telling you is that it's going to be specific to your particular research project. I want you to think beyond just the obvious. Here goes that word again, obvious, right? Think about this. You have a potential research project, and it could be potentially damaging, to maybe your reputation. Okay, you ask, a select number of people to participate. One of them happens to be a preacher. Okay, so his congregation, they consider that very important when they give this guy a job or this lady a job. So if this person is seen entering an establishment where they know that there's a particular survey going on, they put two and two together, that could be a source of potential harm, right? So these are the kind of things, like I said, it's just almost impossible to enumerate all the various potential sources of harm, but that's the direction you want to think whenever you're conducting social science research. Anonymity and confidentiality are two ways to protect participants, against harm. For example, anonymity is actually the state of being unknown, even to the researcher a lot of times. In a double-blind experiment, the participant doesn't know to which group they belong, and nor does the researcher. So truthfully, the researcher says, I don't know if you're taking a placebo or if you're actually taking the real experimental drug, or however you want to apply that. Confidentiality, on the other hand, in that situation, the researcher actually knows, but the thing is, he knows details about the respondent. However, he promises not to divulge any of those responses. Okay, what to do about deception? Sometimes it is necessary to deceive potential participants. Like, for example, you want to study motorcycle gangs or whatever, something where people are a little hesitant to divulge, their behavior. So how do you stop short of actually acting in an unethical manner? Well, Babbie suggests one appropriate solution is to debrief the subject following the experiment. Now, even though they can't be told the true purpose of the study, maybe, but they can, there's no reason they can't know afterwards, is what his contention is. And so maybe that will kind of offset some of it. Yes, they eventually know. I don't know. It's, again, just like the sources of harm, it's all contingent on your particular study. I know, analysis and reporting isn't necessarily on the study guide, and it won't be considered on the midterm. However, consider this. There's one thing that people always feel compelled to do, and that's to hide their negative findings. Okay, they suggest, oh, this is what I anticipate is going to happen. It doesn't go as such whenever they're validating that. Nonetheless, that's important. At least that's another way that scientists can understand, oh, well, that didn't work. So it could help people in the long run. So don't ever hide your negative findings. My words of wisdom for today. An institutional review board, an IRB, is established to protect participants. In other words, they look over research proposals to make sure that there's not going to be any harm, that everything's up to snuff as far as all the laws and everything. Any institution wishing to receive federal money must have an established IRB. So that's enough said. When considering the difference between idiographic reasoning and nomothetic reasoning, just remember idiographic basically exhausts all various possibilities for a phenomenon. It goes into listing all the reasons why you choose to attend a particular college, is what Babbie writes. Basically explores it to the nth degree, whereas nomothetic reasoning, it just a few causal factors that generally impact an event. It kind of sums it up. Now, both of these approaches, both of these rationales, have their place in social science research. It's not that one's any better or more advantageous over the other, except in certain situations. And again, this is going to depend on your particular research topic. So just remember the difference is idiographic is exploring all the options of providing all the reasoning for a particular phenomenon, whereas nomothetic is just summing everything up into a few words. Okay, you have to understand the difference between what is necessary and what is just merely sufficient for a cause. For example, when you're talking about pregnancy, what is the necessary element of the image? You have to be female, right, in order to be pregnant. Versus the sufficient scenario that I put on my next slide, you can fail a test by not going to it. You can also fail it by just going out and partying all night. You know, they're contributing factors, whatever, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not requisite. So necessary is absolute, whereas sufficient qualifies it, but doesn't necessarily qualify it as necessary. See? Okay, I won't lie. There will be questions that ask about the three purposes of research: exploration, descriptive, and explanation. So my recommendation is for you to go through all the practice problems and study guides that are available online. Go particularly into the files section, and you'll see there are actually some materials in there that will have questions and the answer key in the back of each, so that we can kind of go over those, understand, I guess, in a nutshell, exploration is you're just trying to find out the basics. Does this particular phenomenon even exist? Description would be, let's describe it. You know, okay, yes, the phenomenon exists. Now let's just describe some basic things about it. And then explanation is you want to find out considerably more. You know, whereas the descriptive studies are, you know, what, where, when, and how. Explanatory wants to answer why. Why is something the way it is? Okay, units of analysis. You've got a few choices here: individuals, groups, social interaction, you know, like events, activities, and then, of course, artifacts, things. Um, this section is pretty important, so you need to study up on this. I would suggest that you go through the worksheets in the files section. Why is it so important? Well, you know, if you don't do that, it could result in committing like the ecological fallacy, the assumption that something learned about an ecological unit says something about individuals making up that unit. So, you know, you need to understand what it is you're asking and or studying about. For example, the next slide uses an example that you might actually see in the exam. Read the following statement, then determine the appropriate unit of analysis. Most Americans believe in God. So what would the unit of analysis reflect? Well, you've got 5 choices there: individual, group, organization, artifact, or social interaction. A lot of people would have to say group. They would usually say group because it's Americans. However, it's actually the individual. You have to think about the problems. That's why I'm recommended that you go through and practice these. Most Americans believe in God. Belief is an individual act. Even if every American believed in God, they don't do it like with a hive mentality. Each one of the individuals is still making their own decision on that belief. So these are the kind of things you need to read up and practice before you take your exam. Having just stressed the importance of identifying properly the unit of analysis, I mentioned the ecological fallacy. Now, Babbie actually uses a really good analogy to describe the ecological fallacy regarding trying to determine support for a female candidate running for office. He sums it up: the research examined the precincts as the unit of analysis, but sought to draw conclusions about individual voters. So anyway, so read that passage, be familiar with it, and understand what an ecological fallacy is and um, how you can identify that, how you can pick it out of a lineup. Similar to the ecological fallacy is reductionism. And this is where the researcher examines individuals as the unit of analysis, but then seeks to draw conclusions about groups. So understand the difference between the two. Okay, now we're going to start to talk about time dimensions. Let's start with the simple snapshot of how things are, the cross-sectional. I liken this to a layered cake, a multi-layered cake. You cut it right down the center. You can see it from the side, all the various layers. It's an observation at one point in time. That's why you cut the cake once. It's often exploratory or descriptive studies. You're not trying to find out why at this point. You're just trying to find out if, or some general characteristics about it. The census is something we always use as a good example of a cross-sectional study. Now, longitudinal studies are different, and you've got three different ones. You've got your general trend study, where you just study in different groups of people, different points in time, but they all are from the same population. So cohort study, people are actually in a group. They're in a cohort. The group experiences some type of common event, like they're born at the same time or they start school at the same time, whatever. And then you study, the researcher studies them at intervals through time. So you're still studying the same group, but you're not tracking the exact same subjects. You're just wanting to find out that group, how is that group functioning? So a group of graduates, same age, from different colleges, whatever, that kind of thing. Now a panel, think about people sitting at the same table. They're measured the exact same sample of respondents at different points of time. It's always the same people. So you're following, Mrs. Smith kindergarten class. It started in this year and all the way through. You're going to study the same people. Okay, conceptualization and the resulting concept. First of all, know that conceptualization is the process where you actually come to agreement with others about the definitions of a term. You understand, okay, you establish this is what I mean, okay, and that result is the concept. Now, how does conceptualization differ from operationalization? That's another term that we use here in social science research. Babbie says conceptualization is the refinement and specification of abstract concepts, but operationalization is the development of research procedures that result in empirical observations representing those concepts in the world. In other words, operationalization is where now you're able to use those concepts. Like I used on a previous slide, I actually said wealthy. Well, what exactly do I mean by that? And I actually quantified that using numbers. So now I can actually use that term in my methods, versus conceptualization is the basic point where we're coming into agreement. This is what I'm talking about. So now we understand concept. It's the process where we specify what we mean. We come into agreement about the definition of a term, which becomes, it's conceptualization, which becomes a concept. Now you've got three classes of concepts. You've got the direct observables. That's things that you can see. The color of an apple is one example Babbie uses. We didn't create that. We did not construct that. That's a direct observable. Indirect observables, a person's gender. They check a box on a questionnaire. We're not directly observing anybody's plumbing. It's indirect observable. So it's based on an initial observation of something else. Then you've got the constructs. These are things, theoretical creations based on observations, but you can't actually observe these things directly or indirectly, like IQ. It's a summation of answers on a questionnaire, 50 different questions or whatever, and then at the end you crunch all that and you understand the construct IQ. Now we're going to bundle all these terms and try and make sense of them. So we're going to start with indicators. We're going to assume that you've determined and agreed upon your concept, and now you're going to use indicators to help describe a construct. So you can see from the diagram 1, 2, and 3 are going to help you to understand this indirectly, or it's a construct that's not directly observable or indirectly observable. It's just assumed. Similar to IQ, the construct of love is difficult to describe. According to artists, it exists, but how do you tell? Well, you use your indicators. How do you measure it? Well, you can use measurable indicators. Make sure they're measurable. Otherwise, you might as well just, consider the same concept that you're using. But they're measurable indicators. How many times I say I love you? How many times you hold hands? Whatever. And then once you get an indication of all of those, now you understand to a greater degree the construct of love. Okay, hold that thought. Now, how about dimension? You've got the construct love, but you've got multiple dimensions of love. You can love your spouse, you can love your kids, you can love your neighbors, you can love your dogs, you can love God. You can love anything, but they're all different dimensions. You don't love your neighbor the same way you love your dog and whatever. And I'm not even going to go there. So it's just this is to help describe that particular construct to a greater degree. You need to understand the difference between real, nominal, and operational definitions of a concept. A real definition is it basically pertains to the state of the essential nature or the essential attributes of some entity. So basically, it's often so vague that it's not really actually usable. It's in the eye of the beholder. A beauty contest come to mind. So this is something you typically don't use. Babbie says specification of concepts in scientific inquiry depends instead on nominal and operational definitions. So let's go over those. Now, a nominal definition, it's first of all, they represent some consensus or convention about a particular term, but they can be whatever. It's just a name. It's something that you apply to an entity. Whereas operational definitions, they achieve maximum clarity about exactly what a concept means. Now, it's up to you, the researcher, to actually define what that operational definition is. This is what I mean when I say wealthy. This is what I mean, whatever. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that really, defines a term. You can actually, you can actually have other definitions to a term. It's just that you can choose to ignore those others because your definition, your operational definition, pertains more specifically to what your focus is. When creating your surveys, you need to be careful to include these two important qualities. First of all, the questions should be exhaustive, and they should also be mutually exclusive. Okay, what is exhaustive? Exhaustive means that the range of choices that you have is complete. I say this every year whenever pollsters call me during election year. They say, do you belong to the Republicans or the Democrats? I'm like, well, are there any other choices? Yeah, I could be a Republican, or I could be a Democrat, or I could be in the Green Party. I could be an independent. I could be whatever. Their question is not exhaustive. There are other choices that are available. They just elect not to include those in their survey. So make sure that your survey questions are exhaustive. Also, make sure that your answers should be mutually exclusive. On my slide, I use Monty Hall. Let's make a deal. Is it behind door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3? That's mutually exclusive. You cannot choose doors number 2 and 3. You only get one choice. So whenever you're creating a survey question, you should only have one option available to you. And by the way, Monty Hall just recently passed away, so I put my RIP up there. When you think about levels of measurement, you've got nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Nominal is pretty easy. It's the numbers on football jerseys. It's really arbitrary. The make of cars, religion, whatever, race. They're not ordered in any way. You can't really compare them other than to know that they are different. Ordinal, the second slide, shows Usain Bolt way out in front, followed by the second, third, and fourth place runners. They are ranked. They are ordinal, but there's no specific direct interval in between each of the runners. Usain Bolt has a considerable lead over the next three. Now, the next two that you've got, interval and ratio, the big difference is the meaningful 0 point. An interval, think about temperature. Think about the thermometer on the slide. You can see, 20 degrees, and that represents a particular temperature. 10 degrees, 0 degrees. 0 degrees does not mean there's no weather. That means that that's just the name, the description of a particular temperature. So in interval, they are equal distance between each of the measures, and 0 is just like every other number on there. It's just a name. It's just a label. Whereas ratio, now you have a meaningful 0 point and a ratio between the values. Number of patients seen. You can say 5 patients, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0. 0 means that you did not see anybody. Unlike 0 degrees, which means there is weather, albeit very cold, 0 on the ratio scale means that there is nothing. So just remember those distinctions, especially the last. When you think of the difference between reliability and validity, think of it this way. Reliability is equated to consistency. Look at the first bullseye on the slide. It's reliable. It was consistent, although you didn't hit the bullseye. The sight was off on the gun. I'm sure that was what the deal was. But here's the thing. It was consistent. It was reliable. Now, as far as validity, it's not necessarily about being consistent as it is about being, accurate. I would say accuracy would probably be the apt description for validity. So reliability is consistency, and validity is accuracy. Okay, to start, there are a lot of different types of validity, not just these four, although the four that I've got on here are some of your more common ones. Face validity. Now, that's something, it seems to make a lot of sense without a lot of further explanation. You can take it at face value. Makes sense. Criterion related, it relates to some external criterion. For example, one's measure of how well students are going to perform in college. You could base that on SAT scores. The SAT scores are not your measure. They're actually an external measure, but you can use them in your particular research. How about construct validity? One of my favorites. I actually I liken it to a freestanding store. The store, the sign over the doorway of the store says wheelbarrows. Okay, so you walk into the store and it's a dress shop. Like, obviously the sign is wrong. Well, how about your construct of your questions on your survey? That's when you're going to actually use this. Do they actually measure what you say they're going to measure? You say, okay, you've created this survey instrument and you've got all these questions, but do they actually measure what it is that you're trying to measure? That's construct validity. Lastly, content validity, Babbie likens to the math student. Yeah, your math ability, you're great at addition. But can you divide? Can you subtract? Can you multiply? So you've got to consider all the various content, and again, you can relate that, however, to your own research projects. A few final thoughts before you take your midterm. First of all, good luck. I wish you well. I haven't included any kind of trick questions. All my questions, I really try my very hardest to make them straightforward. What I'm trying to do is find a balance of the right degree of rigor to determine how well you know this material versus, fairness to the student. I'm not trying to sabotage your academic career. Word to the wise: go through the content in the file section. Go through those worksheets. There are a lot of questions that actually force you to synthesize this understanding. There'll be choose the unit of analysis. Identify this, identify that. There are a lot of those questions, and many of them are found or very similar to the ones that are found in the worksheets. So go through those. You have the answers to the worksheets. So as you go through, try them out, figure out where your weaknesses are and go from there. Anyway, good luck, and questions, comments, shoot me an email or give me a call.